So different passages of the Bible are known for different reasons. John 3:16, for example, is well known for being a good encapsulation of the gospel, what the Bible is all about, right? If you never actually read the Bible or read the whole thing, but you want to know the gist of the Bible, John 3:16 is a good place to start. It kind of just brings everything together. Psalm 23 is known for being the most well-known psalm, probably one of the most familiar images of Scripture. Well, our gospel reading today is also, in the world of biblical interpretation, is also very, very well known. Actually, it has several titles that have been given to it. Scholars have sometimes referred to it as the prince among difficult parables. Right? That's what you want to know when you're going to preach on a passage. Some call it the parable of cross interpretations. Some call it a notorious puzzle. And my personal favorite, the problem child of biblical exegesis. Wonderful. This is the passage that I will preach on today, to try to make sense of, to proclaim what Christ says to us about his kingdom and our call to Christian living. May the Lord have mercy on our souls. Man. But that's the reality, isn't it? Right? Jesus said these words. We can't just kind of try to explain them away. This passage is a lesson that Jesus had to his disciples, to his followers. And despite the fact that it has been notoriously difficult to figure out, Jesus obviously had a reason for saying these things, for saying these words to his disciples. And for us gathered here today, we believe that Christ speaks these words into our midst and must have some sort of call for us coming out of them. So if you wish to follow along, take a really deep breath. And then turn your Bibles to Luke chapter 16. Let's begin with what we know. We know that this parable is about money. That's the first thing. This is the focus, and in fact, it is the very focus of the entire chapter, Luke chapter 16. After our reading, Jesus tells a story of the rich man and Lazarus. Again, it has a monetary focus. Even the passage before this, which is the parable of the prodigal son, that has interesting things to say about the vain pursuit of earthly glory, of financial wealth, and the damage that can do, that vain pursuit can do, to our spiritual lives and to our relationships. So this parable is about money. And whatever lesson that we are called to derive out of this must speak to the manner in which we engage those financial resources at our disposal. The final point, in verse 13, this is the entire thing that Jesus is aiming to in the previous 12 verses, is you cannot serve God and money. So this is the first thing that we know. Second thing we know is that the manager, right, there's a master who is in charge of the possessions in the land. There's a manager who kind of runs the accounts. The second thing we know is that the manager does exactly what he is charged with. He's charged with cheating the master, of wasting his possessions. Now, there is no indication that the master was evil or he was a tyrant. This is a common occurrence in the ancient world at that time, that there would be a master of a property who lived in a different land, so would place a manager in charge of all the accounts, in charge of the estate. Think of the parable of the talents, exactly the same way. Exactly the same situation is being described in that parable. So the manager is charged with wasting his master's possessions, which he does in verses 5 through 8. Right? He calls in two debtors, one who essentially owes the master an equivalent of 3 years of wage, another who owes the equivalent of 8 years of wage. The manager has them reduce their bill, right? Thereby cheating the master out of 400 gallons of olive oil and 200 bushels of wheat. Now, some argue that, well, this is just removing his commission, or this is removing the excessive interest that would have been lobbed on that account, and so the manager is acting righteously. We don't know that. What we know is that people had a bill, and it was an accepted and understood bill that they owed to the master. And the manager has them change that bill in a manner which is detrimental to the master's accounts. Again, he wastes the master's possessions. The third thing we know, and this is where the entire parable hinges, is that the master praises him for it. Verse 8, the master commends the dishonest manager because he acted shrewdly. So now what the heck is going on? The word for shrewd, it means to be thinking. It means to act wisely. The wisdom of the manager was how he used money, how he used his master's possessions and the authority given to him at that point in a way to secure his earthly livelihood. That was the wisdom of his thought process. So there is this concept in the parables called from lesser to greater. Jesus describes a realistic, but never really kind of the most righteous of situations. He describes a realistic situation, like a woman begging before a judge. And then he says something like, if the judge will grant her request because of her persistence, right, even though he doesn't really want to, how much more will God the Father, who does love us, who does want to answer our prayers, respond to our persistence as we are persistent in prayer? It's from lesser to greater. It was a very popular rabbinic style of teaching. So if the earthly master praises the manager for using his financial wealth in order to secure his earthly livelihood, in order to gain entry into earthly homes, how much more will our heavenly master reward us with eternal homes when we use the provisions given to us in a way to secure our earthly or our heavenly life? So that is really kind of, when we peel back the layers, it's kind of what's going on. So the question that Jesus is really posing to the disciples, and to the Pharisees in the midst, and to us, is, do we use our finances as a tool to serve God and to serve God's kingdom? Or do we use God to serve our vain pursuit of financial wealth? Does the money you possess, does the money you gain, does the money you spend reflect your spiritual life? These are interesting questions, isn't it? You know, St. Augustine is reported to kind of when he would be in charge of services, and they would take up an offering and things like that. He is reported to have said that is you that is being offered, right? Like, our gifts and our offerings represent who we are, right? It's not just a check, it's not just a loonie, it's not just whatever it is who we are. We are offering, and we are in some sense laying before God what our priorities are and what our passions for, and where our passion for God's kingdom actually lies. Have you ever come across a particular phrase that sometimes people use in this kind of interchange between a giver and a receiver of a gift? The recipient of the gift opens it up and says, "Oh, thank you so much," and kind of gushes over the gift. And the giver responds either with, "Oh, it's nothing," or "It's the least I could do." Now think about those phrases. "Oh, it's nothing. I could do something, but I decided to give you something which costs me nothing." Or, "It's the least I could do. I could do more, but I decided to spend the least amount of time, the least amount of money, the least amount of effort on you, because that is what I think you are worth." When we think about what we offer to God, Not just not just spiritual stuff like our prayers or our times of Bible. But when we think about what we offer to God, our physically, our lives, our time, our financial responsibilities, whether it be our talents, do we fall into the trap of thinking, well, what is the least that I could do? What is that which I can offer, which costs me as close to nothing as I possibly can? There's a wonderful little sign that I saw that said, give God what is right, not what is left. Because if we are offering God the least, we have to question, what master are we actually serving? Jesus says you cannot serve two masters. And Jesus, at this point, he really holds up money, and the word is mammon. He holds up money as kind of a rival god, a deity that fights for primacy in the human soul. It's unfortunate that we stopped at verse 13, because verse 14 says that the Pharisees, who loved money, they sneered at Jesus. Right? They got what he was saying. They understood exactly what Jesus was getting to. And what he was saying was that although they surrounded themselves with religious rhetoric, the Pharisees were more concerned about increasing their earthly livelihood, gaining entry into earthly homes, rather than having an eye on the things of God, increasing their heavenly wealth. Does our use of money reflect what we believe about Jesus, about his way of life? Right? Think about it. Jesus calls us to live a life of grace, to live a life of forgiveness, to live a life of love. Well, I know people who have arguments over who owes who $5. Do we believe that the more money that we have, the more importance we have, the more clout we have, the more that we should be listened to, the more that we can kind of push people to do what we want when we want it? Do we see money, do we see our financial wealth as something that I possess, that I get to keep control over? Or do I see money as a gift that I am given in order to enter into the work of God? Those two viewpoints are really drastically different. The fact of the matter is, there is a direct link about what we believe spiritually and what we live physically. And if our physical lives, how we actually live, and that includes the financial world that we have in our own particular aspect of our financial life, if that doesn't line up with some of the biblical and spiritual principles that we say that we believe in, then we have to ask ourselves, well, what's going on? Right? There's a link. Jesus says, whoever could be trusted with a little can be trusted with a lot. And he says this in many places. And what he's really talking about is the need to be faithful with the provisions that God has gifted us in this life as a reflection of our overarching faithfulness to God. Now, all of that isn't just about the amount of zeros on our checks. The dishonest steward is still praised, isn't praised for what he did. He's still dishonest. He was praised for his wisdom, the way he understood the relationship between the money at his disposal and the lives of those he was in contact with. Right? Richard Foster, in his book, Money, Sex, and Power, says that it is possible to tithe 10% and still oppress the poor, right? So it's not just about the coin that we're laying down on the offertory plate. What we are called to do here is live our lives in this place at this time as if we were living already in the kingdom of heaven, as if we were already in God's kingdom. Jesus is talking about something a lot deeper. He is talking about how we live out God's principles, God's values. Jesus says, use worldly wealth to gain friends. And he's really talking about using the resources that God has given us in order to bless people, in order to enter into relationships with them, in order to help them experience the love and the grace of God, which flows through your actions. How can you use your financial resources as a tool to invest in God's work in this world? How can you use money to invest in the spiritual lives of those who are around you, to help them experience God's love and God's grace? Now, I have no suggestions for you. There are no easy answers. This question, nor this parable, they can never really be wrapped up in a tight little bow to say, well, it means this. That's why this is the problem child of exegesis. But we are called, I think, to engage the question: do we use money in no manner which serves God? Or do we try to use God in a way which serves our pursuit of wealth? We are called, I think, to diligently look for the ways that we can express Christ's lordship over the entirety of our lives, our spiritual, our physical, and yes, our financial. We are called deeply, I think, to look into those things, to engage in that thought process, and to see how we can be not dishonest managers, but faithful managers to all that Christ has given us. Amen.